Tonight's story is one that almost defies belief. A tale of a small, hungry boy from the grimmest corner of London, who would one day become the single most recognized face on planet Earth. Not the elegant gentleman with the cane and bowler hat that you've seen printed on posters and coffee mugs 1,000 times, but the real boy underneath all that. The one who went to bed hungry more nights than not, whose father drank himself into an early grave, and whose mother's mind slowly slipped away from her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold on to. So before you get too comfortable, if you're enjoying tonight's journey, feel free to like this video and subscribe, only if you genuinely mean it, of course. Now, turn the lights down low, get yourself wrapped up warm, and let your body sink into the mattress. Let's begin. Have you ever wondered how a boy who once begged for scraps outside a London workhouse ended up wealthier than most kings who ever lived? How a man the whole world adored as the funniest human being alive was, underneath it all, carrying more sorrow than most of us will ever know. How you smile and make millions laugh while your own mother sits locked away in an asylum, unable to recognize your face. Tonight, we're going all the way back to a damp, cramped little room in South London in the spring of 1889, where a fragile baby boy was born into a world that had absolutely no idea what he would one day become. London in 1889 sat at the very center of the largest empire the world had ever seen. It was a city of extraordinary wealth, glittering with gaslight and grandeur, and almost none of that wealth ever touched the district of Walworth, a rundown pocket of South London where, on the 16th of April, a boy named Charlie Chaplin was born. The air in Walworth hung thick with coal smoke and the smell of boiled vegetables and horse droppings. Poverty here wasn't hidden away, it was everywhere, worn openly on every face and every crumbling building. Entire families crammed themselves into single rented rooms. Rent was almost always late, and one bad week, just one, could be the difference between scraping by and being thrown out onto the street entirely. Into this uncertain little world came a delicate child with dark curling hair and enormous eyes, with absolutely no idea that he had just been born directly into the kind of hardship. He would spend his entire life turning into something the world would call genius. To really grasp how far this boy would eventually rise, you first need to understand exactly how low his starting point actually was. Victorian London was a city split violently in two. A wealthy man might step out of a polished carriage in a silk top hat, while barely a stone's throw away, a barefoot child sat in the gutter begging passers-by for a coin or a piece of bread. The British Empire ruled over a quarter of the entire globe and controlled unimaginable riches, and yet it could not manage to feed the poorest children living in the shadow of its own great city. Walworth sat firmly on the losing side of that arrangement, the kind of place respectable people hurried past, handkerchief pressed to nose, muttering about the stench. And the stench, by every historical account, was very real indeed. Picture the smell of an unwashed stable combined with a fish stall left too long in the summer heat, and you're getting close. There was no real sanitation, no refrigeration, and families often slept 4 or 5 to a single bed. A room with its own window was considered something close to a luxury. The Chaplins were not, strictly speaking, the very poorest family in London, but they lived permanently on a financial knife's edge, one where a good month might be followed immediately by a catastrophic one, where there was no savings, no safety net, and absolutely nowhere to turn if things went wrong. And into this precarious little household arrived baby Charlie, blissfully unaware, as all newborns are, of the fragile ground beneath him. He couldn't have known yet that his father was already slipping away into drink, that his mother's fragile health was a clock quietly ticking down, or that whatever small comfort the family briefly enjoyed was about to vanish completely. All he did, like every newborn does, was cry and eat and demand to be noticed, which, in hindsight, made him perfectly suited for the career that awaited him. It's one of history's strange little jokes that some of the funniest people who ever lived were shaped by circumstances that weren't funny at all. And nobody proves that better than this wailing infant from Walworth, who would spend his life turning hunger and grief into laughter for hundreds of millions of people. But before he could make the entire world laugh, he first had to learn exactly where laughter comes from. And in his household, it came from the stage. Charlie wasn't born into money, but he was born into performance, into that world of cheap grease paint and gaslit spotlights that made up the British Music Hall. Both of his parents were performers, singers and entertainers who worked the smoky variety theaters that were, in many ways, the Victorian equivalent of modern television. His mother, Hannah, performed under the stage name Lily Harley, a slender, pretty woman with a sweet voice and an uncanny gift for impressions, a gift her son would inherit completely. His father, also named Charles, had real vocal talent and an equally real weakness for drink. For one brief shining stretch, the family tasted something like comfort, something like applause, something like stability. But show business has never been a kind or loyal profession, and that fragile golden glow around the Chaplin household was already starting to flicker. The music hall was the great entertainment machine of Victorian Britain, loud, boozy, and completely unpretentious, built for working people rather than the wealthy. Picture a hall packed wall to wall with laborers and factory workers, thick with pipe smoke, everyone shouting and laughing and occasionally heckling whoever happened to be on stage. Singers, comedians, acrobats, animal acts, all of them fighting for the fickle attention of an audience that had paid its hard-earned pennies and expected a proper show in return. If a performer could win over a music hall crowd, they could win over absolutely anybody. Hannah, known to her audiences as Lily Harley, made her modest living in exactly this world. She was never a headline act, never truly famous, but she had real charm and an extraordinary eye for detail. She could watch a total stranger cross the street and minutes later recreate their exact walk, their posture, their unconscious little habits, so precisely that young Charlie would collapse into fits of laughter. In their small, cramped room, she would sit by the window narrating the people passing below, becoming each one of them in turn. This, more than anything else, was Charlie's first true education in comedy, no formal training required. Just a mother who happened to be a brilliant, unpaid character actress. His father was an entirely different story. Charles Sr. had a genuinely fine singing voice, and for a while real professional success. He even appeared on theater bills across London, his image printed on sheet music, which in that era was roughly the equivalent of a viral moment today. Money came in. The family moved into slightly better rooms. For a fleeting stretch of time, it felt as though their luck might finally be turning. But the entertainment business then, exactly as now, showed no loyalty whatsoever. Bookings dried up. Audiences moved on to newer faces. A performer adored one season could be entirely forgotten the next, with no pension, no safety net, nothing but the hope of the next booking. And so the family's brief prosperity began to fade slowly, like a lamp running low on oil. What the Chaplins didn't yet fully understand was that the greatest danger to their fragile household wasn't the unpredictable whims of theater audiences at all. It was sitting right there at their own table, in the shape of a bottle that Charlie's father could never quite put down. If you're hopping to find a warm, loving father figure anywhere in this story, you should probably lower your expectations now, because Charles Chaplin Sr. was mostly absent, a name more than a presence. He had real singing talent, but an even greater talent for drinking, and the two did not coexist well. He drifted away from the family while Charlie was still a toddler, leaving Hannah to raise two young boys largely on her own. Occasional court orders forced small child support payments out of him, but the money arrived about as reliably as a sunny English summer, which is to say, rarely, and never when you needed it most. Alcohol and the music hall world went hand in hand, which was part of the trouble. Performers were often paid, quite literally, in the pubs attached to the theaters, and a successful act was expected to drink alongside admirers and promoters as a matter of professional courtesy. For a man already prone to drink, it was less a career than a very slow trap, and Charles Sr. walked straight into it. As his drinking worsened, his reliability collapsed along with it. Bookings slipped away. His voice deteriorated. The money that once flowed steadily into the household slowed to almost nothing. He and Hannah eventually separated entirely, and he became little more than a distant, occasional figure in his sons' lives, technically alive, but functionally gone. For a small child, having a father who exists somewhere out there, but is never actually present, is its own peculiar kind of grief. A hole in the exact shape of a person who was supposed to be there and simply wasn't. There was one strange, difficult stretch when Charlie and his older half-brother Sidney were sent to live with their father and his new partner, after Hannah's own struggles left her temporarily unable to care for them. It was not a happy arrangement. The household was chaotic and steeped in drink, and the boys were often neglected, left to fend for themselves for long stretches at a time. It wasn't so much a rescue as a sideways move into a different flavor of hardship. Eventually, the drink claimed him entirely. Charles Chaplin Sr. died young, his talent wasted, his family left to manage without him. For Charlie, it was a brutal early lesson in exactly where a lack of discipline could lead a person. A lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life, guarding his money and his self-control with an almost obsessive intensity, as if forever trying to outrun the fate that had swallowed his father whole. But that grim lesson still lay ahead. First, a tiny Charlie was about to get his very first, completely accidental taste of the stage. Every legend needs an origin story, and Charlie's arrived when he was barely old enough to see over the footlights. He was around 5 years old, watching from the wings as his mother performed, when her voice suddenly cracked mid-song and dissolved into a thin, humiliating croak. The crowd, as music hall crowds always did, began to jeer. And then, in a moment that sounds almost too perfect to be true but genuinely happened exactly this way, little Charlie was pushed out onto the stage to fill the silence. He sang. He mimicked. Coins rained down onto the stage floor, and the delighted crowd roared with laughter and applause. His mother's performing career was quietly ending that very night. His own had just accidentally begun. To really understand how frightening that moment must have been, you have to understand what a music hall crowd was actually like. This wasn't a polite, hushed audience sitting respectfully in the dark. This was a rowdy, half-drunk mass of people who'd paid for a good night out and would let you know immediately, and loudly, if they weren't getting one. A performer whose voice gave out didn't receive gentle sympathy. They received boos, jeers, and quite possibly a piece of fruit thrown from the cheap seats. It was the original hostile internet comment section, except the critics were sitting right there in the room. So when Hannah's voice broke apart mid-performance, it wasn't merely embarrassing. It was a visible, public collapse of the very thing keeping food on her family's table. Her throat, weakened by illness and years of strain, simply gave out that night, leaving her stranded in front of a crowd rapidly turning ugly. What happened next was pure desperate instinct, a stage manager with a collapsing act, and a charming child conveniently standing nearby. Little Charlie, who had watched his mother's act countless times and already knew her songs by heart, was pushed out into the blinding lights to buy some time. Most 5-year-olds, faced with a room full of jeering adults, would freeze completely or burst into tears. Charlie did the exact opposite. He launched straight into a popular song of the day, mimicking the performers he'd studied from the wings for years, and the crowd, utterly charmed by this tiny, fearless child, fell silent, and then erupted into delight. And then came the moment that reveals, in miniature, the entire genius he would spend his life developing. As he sang, the audience began tossing coins onto the stage, the music hall's traditional sign of real approval. And Charlie, all of 5 years old, simply stopped singing mid-song to announce that he would go and collect the money first and finish the song afterward. The room absolutely erupted. That small, unplanned joke, a cheeky child interrupting his own performance to prioritize the cash, brought the house down harder than any rehearsed routine ever could have. Even at 5 years old, he understood something profound about comedy, that an honest, slightly greedy human impulse is funnier than any polished bit. He scurried around the stage gathering coins, threw in a few more impressions for good measure, and had the entire room in the palm of his tiny hand. It was, by every account a triumph. It was also the very last time his mother would ever perform on a stage. Her voice never fully returned after that night, and with it went the family's only real source of income. There's a strange, aching symmetry to it, a torch passing from one generation to the next in the space of a single evening. As Hannah stepped out of the spotlight for the final time, her little boy had just, without either of them realizing it, stepped into his own. Hannah Chaplin was the sun around which Charlie's entire small world turned, which made it all the more devastating when that sun slowly began to go dark. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and the relentless grinding weight of poverty began wearing away at her mind. She started suffering episodes that frightened both her sons badly, moments where she seemed to drift somewhere else entirely, hearing and seeing things that weren't there. Eventually, she was taken away to be treated in an asylum, and the two boys who adored her were left essentially alone in one of the harshest cities on earth. For Charlie, watching his mother slowly come undone was a wound that never fully closed. It was a particular kind of helplessness, the kind you carry quietly for the rest of your life, a sadness that would echo softly beneath even his funniest films decades later. With her performing career over and her husband long gone, Hannah tried everything she could to keep the small family afloat. She took in sewing work, hunching over a needle for hour after hour in poor light for pitiful pay. She pawned their few possessions one by one, a slow, humiliating liquidation of everything the family had ever owned, until there was almost nothing left to sell. It was the kind of grinding, unglamorous poverty that doesn't destroy a person in one dramatic blow, but wears them down instead through 1,000 small daily defeats. And Hannah absorbed every single one of them while trying desperately to shield her boys from the very worst of it. But there's only so much a human mind and body can endure. Chronic hunger, endless stress, and very possibly an untreated illness combined to push her far past her limits. Looking back with modern medical understanding, doctors now suspect that severe malnutrition, and perhaps an underlying infection, may have played a direct role in her mental decline, that her mind was, quite literally, starving right alongside the rest of her body, in an era that had no real understanding of that connection, and even less support to offer the desperate poor. The episodes came gradually at first, then more and more frequently. She would grow confused, speak about things that made no sense, and slowly lose her grip on the reality her sons could plainly see around them. For two young boys, there are very few experiences more frightening than watching a beloved parent transform in front of you into someone you barely recognize. The one solid anchor in an already chaotic life suddenly coming loose. Charlie, still just a small child himself, found himself in the impossible position of trying to look after the very person who was supposed to be looking after him. A reversal of roles no child should ever have to carry. Eventually, she was committed to an asylum. The institutions of that era were blunt, often cruel instruments, designed far more for containment than for any genuine attempt at treatment. She would be released and then readmitted more than once over the following years, a heartbreaking cycle of brief recovery followed by painful relapse. Each separation tore at Charlie a little more, and every fragile reunion carried with it the quiet dread of the next inevitable parting. He loved her fiercely, with an intensity that never faded, and even decades later, at the very height of his wealth and fame, he made absolutely certain she was cared for in comfort, finally able to give her the security she had never once been able to give herself. But that was still a long way off. In the present moment, a small boy and his older brother were left essentially alone in one of the harshest cities on the planet, their mother locked away, their father drowning at the bottom of a bottle. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being a child without functioning parents, a sense of standing at the very edge of a vast, cold world with no one there to hold your hand. Charlie was about to discover exactly how cold that world could get. Because for boys in his position, with nowhere else to turn, the state had a solution, and its name alone was enough to make any Victorian child's blood run cold. For a poor family in Victorian England, There was one single word that struck more fear than any ghost story ever could, and that word was workhouse. These were grim, prison-like institutions, the very last resort for the destitute, deliberately designed to be miserable enough that no one would ever want to rely on them unless they had absolutely no other choice left. With his mother now institutionalized and his father worse than useless, Charlie found himself passing through the gates of the Lambeth workhouse, a small child processed like a piece of paperwork rather than a human being. Families were separated the moment they arrived. The food was thin and utterly joyless. The whole place ran on cold routine and quiet, constant shame. It was the very lowest rung of the entire social ladder, and Charlie found himself standing on it before he'd even lost all of his baby teeth. The underlying philosophy behind the workhouse system was, frankly, monstrous by any standard we'd recognize today. The authorities of the time genuinely believed that poverty was largely a matter of moral failing, a sign of laziness or poor character, and that any assistance offered to the poor needed to be made so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would ever bring themselves to accept it. This meant conditions were kept deliberately harsh, deliberately humiliating, and deliberately stripped of anything resembling comfort. It was a support system engineered from the very ground up to punish the people it claimed to be helping. Upon arrival, families were broken apart with brisk, business-like efficiency. Men were sent one way, women another, children a third, all housed entirely separately with little to no chance of seeing one another. For Charlie, this meant being torn away from his brother and the very last shreds of anything familiar, absorbed instead into a mass of anonymous, identically dressed children. Their clothing was a coarse, scratchy uniform designed to strip away any last trace of individuality, turning every child into an interchangeable unit of the poor. You didn't arrive at a workhouse as a person. You arrived as a problem waiting to be managed. The food was a masterpiece of joylessness, engineered to sustain life at the absolute bare minimum, while never once offering the sin of actual enjoyment. Thin, watery gruel and hard bread formed the backbone of the diet, served in monotonous rotation, rarely in generous portions. A growing boy was left perpetually, quietly hungry, his stomach a constant low complaint that never fully went away. The days themselves were governed by rigid, unforgiving routine. Bells rang, lines formed, and every single hour was accounted for, with a discipline that left absolutely no room for play, curiosity, or anything resembling a normal childhood. Silence was often strictly enforced, laughter actively discouraged, and the entire atmosphere pressed down on everyone inside like a heavy, colorless blanket. For a boy whose mind was already fizzing with imagination and mischief, this deadening routine must have been its own particular kind of torture, a slow, steady smothering of the spirit. And hanging over everything always was the shame. To be a workhouse child was to wear a visible mark of the very lowest possible status, pitied at best and openly despised at worst by the world outside its walls. Charlie was old enough by then to feel the sting of that keenly, to understand with painful clarity exactly how far his family had fallen. It planted in him a deep, lifelong horror of poverty, and a fierce, burning determination to escape it, a determination that would drive him for the rest of his days. But escape was not yet on the table. First, the state had one more grim institution waiting for him, one that would carry him even further from everything he had ever known. From the workhouse, Charlie was transferred to a school for orphaned and destitute children, a bleak institution located well outside London. Here the days were rigidly structured, the discipline harsh, and homesickness sat permanently in his stomach like a stone that simply refused to dissolve. Worst of all, he was frequently separated from Sidney, his older half-brother and fiercest protector, the one person who made the entire ordeal even remotely survivable. Sidney was Charlie's anchor, his defender, and later his shrewd business partner, and being kept apart from him made an already lonely childhood almost unbearable. Being sent well outside London meant Charlie wasn't just poor and parentless anymore. He was also physically removed from the only streets and rhythms he understood. For a child, geography matters enormously. Being sent away like this was its own particular flavor of abandonment, a sense of being posted off like an unwanted parcel to somewhere distant and unfamiliar. The chaos of Walworth, grim as it undeniably was, had at least been his. This new place was cold, foreign, and run entirely by strangers who saw him as just one small mouth to feed among hundreds of others. Discipline at these institutions was, true to the spirit of the era, administered liberally and often with a cane. Corporal punishment wasn't viewed as cruelty back then. It was considered character building, the standard tool for keeping large numbers of children in line. Charlie experienced his fair share of it, including at least one particularly memorable public caning that left a lasting impression, as public canings tend to do. In an age that treated a child's discomfort as morally instructive rather than harmful, comfort simply wasn't part of the equation. The routine was relentless, day after identical day. Rise at a set hour, wash in cold water, line up, eat the meager rations, sit through lessons, complete chores, repeat. There was schooling of a basic sort, hammered into the children alongside practical trade skills meant to prepare them for a lifetime of manual labor. It wasn't designed to nurture talent or curiosity. It was designed to produce compliant, employable poor people, and it had all the warmth of a factory conveyor belt. Through all of it, the ache of homesickness never truly left him. It wasn't homesickness for any particular comfortable house, because he had never actually had one. It was homesickness for his mother, for his brother, for that intangible feeling of simply belonging to someone. That longing settled deep into him and never fully departed, becoming part of the emotional bedrock from which he would eventually build his art. The little tramp's uncanny ability to convey profound loneliness with nothing more than a single wistful glance didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a small boy lying awake in an institutional dormitory, missing everyone he had ever loved. Sydney was the one great exception, the single warm point in all that cold. Older, tougher, endlessly loyal, he was Charlie's protector whenever the two of them were together, and his most painful absence whenever they were apart. Sydney would later spend time in the Navy before returning to become instrumental in managing Charlie's career, negotiating his contracts and guarding his interests with the fierce devotion of an older brother who had simply never stopped looking out for his little one. Their bond, forged entirely in shared hardship, would go on to become one of the single most important relationships of Charlie's entire life. But brothers cannot always stay together, and the state certainly wasn't going to house him forever. Sooner or later, a boy in Charlie's position had to face the fundamental question of pure survival on his own 2 feet. How exactly does a child with no money, no functioning parents, and no real prospects manage to keep himself fed? Charlie was about to find out, one odd job at a time. While most children today spend their early years worrying about homework and screen time, young Charlie spent his worrying about where his very next meal was coming from. Long before he was even a teenager, he was hustling for coins in every honest and semi-honest way a small boy could manage. He ran errands. He swept up hair in a barber shop. He sold newspapers on street corners. He worked for a printer and briefly for a glassblower. None of it lasted long, and none of it paid particularly well, but all of it taught him a relentless, streetwise resourcefulness. He learned how to read a room instantly, how to charm a total stranger in seconds, and how to survive purely on wit and grit. It was an education money simply could not buy, and it would prove far more valuable in the end than anything a formal classroom could have offered him. Child labor in Victorian Britain wasn't considered scandalous in the slightest. It was simply how the world worked. Poor children were expected to contribute to their own survival the moment they were physically capable of it, and the very notion of a protected, carefree childhood was a luxury reserved almost exclusively for the wealthy. So Charlie, small, thin, and perpetually hungry, threw himself headfirst into the chaotic marketplace of odd jobs that a resourceful boy could scrape together in a big city. The sheer variety of his early employment reads almost like a list dreamed up by an extremely desperate careers advisor. He swept hair in a barber shop, breathing in the clippings of half of South London. He hawked newspapers on busy street corners, competing fiercely with other boys for the best spots and the most generous customers. He assisted a printer, hauling heavy materials and choking on ink fumes all day long. He even tried his hand briefly at glassblowing, a trade involving furnaces hot enough to make a summer heatwave feel gentle by comparison, a genuinely alarming line of work for a small child to be anywhere near. Each job came and went in turn, usually because he was too young, too small, or the work itself simply dried up. But what none of these jobs offered in stability or fair pay, they more than made up for in something Charlie would come to value even more: a graduate-level education in human nature. Selling newspapers, you learn fast exactly which passers-by will actually buy and which ones will simply brush past you, how to catch someone's eye, how to close a sale in 3 seconds flat. Working in a barber shop, you get to observe every conceivable type of customer: the vain, the cheap, the endlessly chatty, the perpetually sour, an endless parade of characters, all filed carefully away for later use. Charlie was, without even realizing it, assembling an enormous mental library of human behavior. He was also developing a genuine survivor's instinct, a sharp and constant awareness of his surroundings, and an ability to adapt on the fly. When you never quite know where your next meal is coming from, you become extraordinarily attuned to both opportunity and danger. You learn to charm the person who might feed you, and to sidestep the one who might rob you instead. You learn that a well-timed smile can open doors that force never will. These were survival skills first and foremost, but in a very real sense, they were also performance skills, and Charlie was quietly mastering both at exactly the same time. Through all of it ran one single unbreakable thread: a burning determination to get out. Charlie never accepted his poverty as some kind of fixed destiny. He remembered the roar of that long-ago crowd on the night his mother's voice had failed him, and he wanted that feeling again with a hunger that outmatched even his hunger for food. He knew, with a child's stubborn certainty, that the stage was going to be his way up and out of all of it. All he needed now was a foot in the door. And that foot, as it happened, was about to arrive strapped into a pair of wooden clogs. Charlie's first real break arrived in the unlikely form of a pair of wooden clogs. He joined a troupe of child performers known as the 8 Lancashire Lads, a clog dancing act that toured the music halls of Britain, hammering out rhythms with their wooden shoes on bare wooden stages. For a boy who had known nothing but instability his entire short life, life on the road with the troupe offered something almost unimaginably precious: structure, regular meals, and best of all, the intoxicating thrill of standing in front of a live audience night after night. He wasn't the star of the show, not yet. He was just one small dancer among 8, clattering along in unison with the others. But he was watching, always watching. He was studying timing, studying how a crowd responded to different rhythms, absorbing the invisible craft of holding a room's attention. Clog dancing was a genuinely popular form of entertainment in that era, a percussive, foot-stamping spectacle in which performers wearing heavy wooden-soled shoes hammered out intricate, synchronized rhythms on the stage floor. Done well, it was almost mesmerizing to watch, a kind of human drum machine decades before drum machines existed. A troupe of children performing it in perfect unison was exactly the sort of wholesome, high-energy novelty act that music hall audiences of the time adored, and the 8 Lancashire Lads made a decent, steady little living touring the country with it. For Charlie, joining this troupe was nothing short of transformative. Consider everything it offered a boy in his exact position. There was regular work, which meant regular food, an almost unimaginable luxury after years of thin workhouse gruel. There was a place to sleep each night, structure to his days, and the companionship of other children going through the exact same experience. After years of instability, abandonment, and institutional cold, this modest, rickety traveling routine must have felt like astonishing security. But the true prize wasn't the food or the structure. It was the audience. Standing on a stage, feeling the eyes of an entire room fixed on him, hearing applause wash over the troupe at the end of a number, Charlie experienced something he would spend the rest of his life chasing. There is a particular electricity to live performance, a direct current running between performer and crowd, and for a boy starved of love, attention, and any real sense of security, that current was pure oxygen. Every round of applause was a small reassurance that he mattered, that he existed, that he was genuinely good at something. It's not hard to see how a lonely child might become permanently, hopelessly hooked on that feeling. He was, admittedly, a very small cog in a much larger machine, one of 8 nearly identical boys in a chorus line, not a soloist and certainly not a star. But Charlie was never simply performing. He was studying. Even as he clattered through the routines night after night, part of his mind was always fixed on the crowd, noting exactly what made them laugh, what bored them, when their attention began to wander, and when it snapped sharply back. He was absorbing the invisible mechanics of entertainment itself, the rhythm of a good act, the delicate way a room could be won or lost in a matter of seconds. It was market research conducted from directly inside the product, and Charlie proved to be an exceptionally attentive researcher. He also began to quietly suspect that dancing wasn't really his true calling. The clogs were fine. The structure was more than welcome. But his instincts kept pulling him toward something else entirely, toward comedy, toward character, toward making people laugh rather than simply tapping his feet in perfect time. He watched the comedians sharing the same bills with a special kind of hunger, sensing that his real talent lay somewhere in that direction. The Lancashire lads had given him a foothold, a taste of the professional stage, and a full stomach. Now he wanted more. He wanted to act, to command a stage as a person in his own right, rather than as one pair of dancing feet among 8. Clog dancing had been fun, but Charlie's real ambitions lay firmly in acting, and he chased them with a determination bordering on obsession. Still just a boy, he began landing small roles in touring stage plays, most notably as a cheeky page boy in a production based on Sherlock Holmes, a part he would play on and off for several years. On stage, he discovered he had a completely natural instinct for comedy and for winning an audience's affection, an instinct that simply could not be taught in any classroom. He was still poor. He still wasn't always certain where he'd sleep on any given night, but for the very first time in his short life, he could see the outline of a possible future stretching out ahead of him. Breaking into acting, even at the humble level available to a poor teenage boy with no connections, required a kind of relentless persistence that would have broken most people. There were no talent scouts wandering street corners, no easy auditions, no shortcuts whatsoever for a child with no money and no family name to open doors. Charlie simply presented himself again and again, chased down every possible lead, and made himself impossible to overlook. He had one enormous advantage. He was already a seasoned, comfortable performer in a way that many older, better-connected hopefuls simply weren't. Years of clattering clogs and hustling for coins on street corners had given him a natural poise that could never be faked. The page boy role became something of a steady anchor for him during these years. It wasn't a large part, but it was a good one, a sharp-tongued, plucky young servant with just enough personality for a clever performer to shine within it. Charlie played the role across various touring companies over an extended stretch of time, sharpening his timing and his delivery with every single performance, gradually building both his skill and a modest but growing reputation within the profession. Touring life remained genuinely hard, cheap lodgings, endless uncomfortable train journeys, wages that never quite stretched far enough. But it was the life he wanted, and that made all the difference in the world to him. It was during these years on the road that Charlie truly discovered the shape of his own particular gift. He found that he could make an audience laugh not simply by falling over or pulling silly faces, but through something far subtler, a single look, a well-placed pause, a perfectly judged reaction to something happening around him. He learned that he could make an entire crowd like him, could win their affection and pull them onto his side within moments of stepping into the light. This is a rare and genuinely precious quality, the sort of thing that separates a merely competent performer from a truly magnetic one, and it simply cannot be taught in any drama school. Either a performer has it or they don't. Charlie, it turned out, had it in tremendous abundance. Life, of course, remained precarious. The pay stayed modest, the future stayed uncertain, and there were surely plenty of nights when Charlie genuinely wondered where he'd end up sleeping. But for the first time, that uncertainty was finally pointed in a hopeful direction. He was no longer simply surviving from one day to the next. He was building something, brick by careful brick, moving with real purpose toward a goal he could now actually see ahead of him. All he needed now was a bigger stage on which to prove himself completely. And that stage, run by the undisputed king of British physical comedy, was about to open its doors to him. Every great comedian needs a proper training ground, and for Charlie, that training ground turned out to be the legendary company of Fred Karno, the reigning king of British physical comedy. Karno ran a sprawling troupe of comic performers who specialized in wordless slapstick sketches, elaborate, tightly choreographed pantomimes of chaos, pratfalls, and split-second precision timing. Getting hired by Karno was a serious achievement for a young, unknown performer, and Charlie earned his place through sheer raw talent, aided considerably by his brother Sidney, who had already joined Karno's company and helped open the door for him. Fred Karno was a genuine phenomenon of the British entertainment world, a former acrobat turned impresario who had built an entire empire out of making people fall over in precisely the funniest possible way. His particular genius lay in understanding that comedy could be treated as a precision craft, that a well-built slapstick sketch was engineered with the same care as a fine watch, every single gag timed down to the split second, every collision choreographed like a dance. He drilled his performers relentlessly until their routines ran with clockwork accuracy, and the results were sketches so beloved they toured successfully for years on end. Landing a spot in Karno's company was, for a young comic performer, roughly equivalent to a struggling musician being invited to join the single most respected band in the entire country. When Charlie finally got his chance to audition, Karno was reportedly unimpressed at first glance by this pale, quiet young man standing before him. But the moment Charlie actually began to perform, every trace of that doubt evaporated instantly. On stage, the shy, nervous boy transformed completely, and his talent proved so undeniable that a place in the company was secured almost immediately. What followed was the single most important artistic education of Charlie's entire life. Karno's sketches were built almost entirely around physical comedy and pantomime, telling their stories purely through movement, expression, and impeccable timing, rather than any spoken dialogue at all. This suited Charlie perfectly, because he possessed an extraordinary natural gift for expressing complex emotion and intention using nothing but his body. He learned exactly how to make an audience anticipate a fall, and then subvert their expectations entirely. He learned how to build a single gag layer upon layer until it finally detonated into laughter. He learned that one perfectly held pause could wring more genuine comedy out of a moment than a dozen frantic, flailing movements ever could. He also learned, crucially, the deep value of pathos, the delicate art of mixing real sadness in among the silliness. The very best Karno routines weren't merely funny. They had an actual beating heart underneath them, a thin thread of genuine humanity that made an audience care about the poor fool stumbling helplessly through the chaos on stage. Charlie absorbed this particular lesson more deeply than perhaps anyone else in the company, and it would go on to become the single defining feature of his own future work, the exact quality that would eventually separate him from every other clown who could only make people laugh, and nothing more. He understood, at a level few performers ever reach, that audiences laugh hardest of all at the underdog they've also come to genuinely love. Within the Karno company, One particular role in his repertoire made Charlie a genuine standout among the other performers. He became well known within the troupe for playing a hopeless, staggering drunk, a routine that demanded extraordinary balance, precise control, and split-second timing to make each collapse look effortless and hilarious rather than merely alarming. It sounds simple enough on paper, but convincing physical comedy of this caliber is brutally difficult work, far closer to ballet than to simple buffoonery. Here is the thing that most audiences never fully appreciate about truly great physical comedy. Making your own body appear clumsy and completely out of control demands the exact opposite of actual clumsiness. To fall convincingly without ever hurting yourself, to stagger in a way that reads as hilarious rather than genuinely alarming, to time each stumble so it lands precisely on the beat. All of this requires the coordination of a trained gymnast paired with the timing sense of a professional musician. It's genuinely closer to dance than to accident, and Charlie made the whole thing look effortless, which is exactly why it was so brilliant, and exactly why almost no one else could ever quite replicate it. His total commitment to the character was another quality that set him apart from his peers. Charlie didn't simply perform a drunk on stage, he became one, sinking so completely into the role that every gesture, every glazed expression, every unsteady wobble felt like it had been observed directly from real life rather than invented purely for entertainment. And of course, in a very real sense, it had been observed from real life. He had grown up surrounded by drink and its devastating effects, had watched his own father slowly dissolve into it, and now, in a bitter and genuinely brilliant transformation, he mined that painful personal familiarity for pure comedy gold. There is something almost defiant about a boy taking the very force that destroyed his own father and turning it into the exact routine that would go on to make his name. Fellow performers, a notoriously hard-to-impress bunch of people, quickly recognized that they were sharing a stage with someone genuinely, unusually gifted. Word began spreading throughout the tight-knit world of professional comedy that this young Chaplin fellow was one to watch closely, a performer with a rare and complete command over his own craft. All that remained now was pure luck, that final essential ingredient no amount of raw skill can ever conjure up entirely on its own. In 1910, Charlie boarded a ship bound for America as part of Carnot's touring company, crossing an entire ocean toward a country he had only ever imagined from a distance. For a boy who had grown up genuinely believing the world simply ended somewhere at the edge of a London slum, the sheer overwhelming scale of America hit him like a physical wave the moment he arrived. The towns were bigger. The audiences were louder and more enthusiastic. A palpable sense of limitless possibility hung in the air like static electricity. He toured relentlessly across the American vaudeville circuit, performing his sketches night after night in city after city, slowly building a genuine reputation among exactly the people who mattered most in that industry. He didn't know it yet, but this was the very country that would eventually make him a god, and then, decades later, quietly break his heart completely. The ocean crossing itself was an adventure of a kind Charlie could scarcely have imagined only a few years earlier. To go from scavenging for coins on the streets of Walworth to boarding a genuine transatlantic steamer bound for America was a leap so vast it must have felt like stepping directly into a storybook. The voyage took the better part of 2 weeks, a slow, rolling passage across gray and seemingly endless water. And for a young man who had never once left his own country, every single mile carried him further into the completely unknown. Whatever seasickness and cramped, uncomfortable conditions he endured along the way, the sheer romance of the journey surely outweighed all of it. When he finally arrived, America hit him like a physical wave. Everything felt bigger, louder, and more energetic than the tired old world he had left behind him. The cities pulsed with restless ambition. The streets teemed with immigrants from every corner of the globe, all chasing their own personal version of a dream, and the entire country seemed to vibrate with a genuine conviction that anything was possible for anyone willing to work hard enough for it. For a boy who had been taught by circumstance that his place in the world was fixed low and permanent, this intoxicating spirit of limitless possibility felt like nothing short of a revelation. In Britain, class had always been destiny. In America, or so it seemed at the time, destiny was genuinely up for grabs. The touring itself remained absolutely grueling. A relentless grind through vaudeville houses scattered across an entire sprawling continent. Vaudeville was essentially the American cousin of the British music hall, a variety format packed tight with singers, comedians, acrobats, and novelty acts of every conceivable kind, and Carno's company slotted into it beautifully. Charlie performed his sketches town after town, city after city, night after night, sharpening his craft in front of American crowds who laughed at his physical comedy every bit as heartily as British audiences had. Comedy, he was quickly learning, was a language that needed absolutely no translation, and his fluency in it crossed borders effortlessly. Life on the road remained far from glamorous, endless train journeys, indifferent lodgings, and the perpetual low-grade exhaustion that comes with a traveling performer's life. But Charlie was already well accustomed to hardship, and this particular hardship was in pursuit of an actual dream rather than mere survival, which made all the difference in the world to him. He saved his money carefully, ever mindful of his father's ruinous fate, and he watched and absorbed absolutely everything around him, filing away impressions of this vast new country the same way he had once filed away the mannerisms of strangers passing beneath his mother's window. Most importantly of all, he was beginning to get noticed. Within the tight, gossipy professional world of American entertainment, people were starting to talk about an extraordinarily gifted young Englishman traveling with Carno's troupe. The one who could make an entire room roar with laughter using nothing but his own body and impeccable timing. And just as Charlie was beginning to make his mark on the American stage, a strange, flickering new medium was exploding rapidly into existence, one that happened to be desperately hungry for exactly the kind of talent he possessed. By the time Charlie returned to America for a second tour, the entertainment world was being turned completely upside down by a strange new invention, the moving picture. Silent film was exploding in popularity across the country, and the fledgling studios producing these short films were desperate for performers who could make audiences laugh without speaking a single word, which happened to be precisely Charlie's specialty. During his performances, he caught the attention of people connected to the film business who saw something genuinely special in this expressive, endlessly flexible young Englishman. An offer eventually arrived, and it meant leaving behind the stage he had worked so relentlessly hard to conquer for the uncertain, often sneered at world of the movies. It was a gamble, but Charlie Chaplin had been gambling with his own survival since he was 5 years old, and he had grown very good at it indeed. The moving picture in those early years was a genuine marvel, a technology so new that people still gathered in open astonishment just to watch flickering images dance across a blank screen. Short comedic films in particular were finding enormous popularity, screened in modest storefront theaters where working people could pay a few pennies to escape their difficult lives for a short while. It was cheap, accessible entertainment for the masses, and demand for it was absolutely insatiable. The studios churning out these films needed a constant, steady supply of performers, and above all else, they needed performers who could be genuinely funny without any sound at all, since sound was not yet part of the equation whatsoever. This last point cannot possibly be overstated, because it was the exact hinge on which Charlie's entire future would eventually turn. Silent film could not use spoken dialogue, which meant that absolutely everything had to be conveyed through movement, facial expression, and gesture alone. A performer who relied heavily on clever spoken lines was essentially useless in this new medium, but a performer who could tell an entire story with nothing more than a raised eyebrow, a shrug, or a perfectly timed fall was pure gold. Charlie, trained deeply in the wordless pantomime tradition of Fred Carno, was almost supernaturally well suited to it. It was as though he had spent his entire life unknowingly preparing himself for a medium that had only just been invented. An offer duly arrived, and with it came a genuine dilemma. Charlie had worked ferociously hard to reach his respected position on the legitimate stage, and film, by comparison, was widely looked down upon by serious theatrical people as a cheap, vulgar novelty, a distinctly lesser art suited only to lesser talents. To abandon the legitimate stage for the flickering screen was, in the eyes of many respected performers, a step sharply downward rather than upward. There was real risk that the whole thing might turn out to be nothing more than a passing fad. But Charlie had a gambler's eye and a survivor's sharpened instincts, both honed by a lifetime of hard calculation. He weighed the risk carefully against the reward, considered the money on offer against the strange new possibilities of this untested medium, and made his decision. He would take the leap. Charlie signed with Keystone Studios, the frantic comedy factory run by the boisterous Max Sennett, famous for its wild chase scenes, custard pie fights, and its bumbling Keystone cops. Suddenly, the young man who had spent years polishing every single gesture to perfection on the stage found himself thrown into an assembly line of comedy churned out at absolutely breakneck speed. The pay was far better than anything the music hall had ever offered him, a genuine leap upward in his fortunes. But the style could not have been more different from his own carefully developed instincts. Keystone comedy was loud, fast, and gloriously stupid, built entirely on collision rather than character. Charlie arrived brimming with ideas about subtlety and pathos, and the studio, in turn, was brimming with pies. Keystone Studios was, in its own way, a genuine marvel of the young film industry. A relentless production line that pumped out short comedies at a pace that would make even a modern content creator weep with exhaustion. Max Sennett had essentially industrialized slapstick comedy, developing a distinct house style built on chaotic, high-energy mayhem that audiences absolutely adored without exception. Subtlety simply was not on the menu at Keystone. Volume was everything. The financial improvement in Charlie's life was immediate and genuinely dramatic. The salary Keystone offered him dwarfed anything he had ever earned grinding through the vaudeville circuit, representing a real and enormous step-up in his fortunes. For a young man who had known real, gnawing hunger, who guarded every single coin with the wariness of someone who still remembered the Workhouse vividly, this was no small thing at all. But the creative reality proved to be a genuinely rude shock. Charlie had spent years carefully developing a comic style rooted deeply in nuance, in character, in the delicate marriage of laughter and real emotion. Keystone believed in none of these things whatsoever. Keystone believed in shooting fast, packing in as many gags as humanly possible, and moving immediately on to the next picture. So Charlie found himself in a strange and deeply frustrating position, richer than he had ever imagined possible, yet creatively caged, surrounded by a style of comedy he privately considered crude and beneath his own abilities. He was a sophisticated craftsman who had been dropped directly into a pie factory, and the mismatch grated on him from the very first day. Charlie's first steps in front of a motion picture camera were not at all the triumphant fanfare you might reasonably expect. He found the entire process baffling and creatively suffocating, hemmed in constantly by directors who wanted him to flail about wildly and mug shamelessly for the lens exactly like everyone else on the lot. His instinct for quiet, human comedy, the pause, the small reaction, the flicker of dignity hidden beneath the pratfall, was completely at odds with the studio's frantic crash and bash philosophy. He argued constantly, he sulked, and he grew increasingly convinced that he could direct himself far better than anyone currently directing him. For a complete newcomer, this was a genuinely outrageous level of confidence to display. But Charlie had spent his entire life certain of exactly one thing, that he understood precisely how to make people feel something, and he wasn't about to let a pie in the face convince him otherwise. Some at the studio reportedly began quietly wondering whether hearing this difficult young Englishman had been an expensive mistake after all. There was a real moment where his entire film career genuinely hung in a delicate balance. But Charlie's stubbornness, so irritating to many of his colleagues at the time, was also in the end his salvation. He absolutely refused to abandon his conviction that he understood comedy and human emotion far better than the frantic house style allowed. He kept pushing to inject real character, careful timing, and genuine feeling into his work, kept lobbying relentlessly to direct himself, kept insisting there was simply a better way to do all of it. Then in 1914 came the single most important costume change in the entire history of cinema. Told simply to throw together a funny getup for a scene, Charlie assembled an outfit from odds and ends borrowed off various other actors on the lot: baggy trousers, a tight little coat, oversized battered shoes worn deliberately on the wrong feet, a bamboo cane, a small bowler hat, and a tiny square smudge of a mustache. When he put it all on and shuffled into character for the very first time, something almost supernatural happened. A whole complete person came instantly to life. The tramp was poor but proud, shabby yet dignified, forever getting knocked down and forever tipping his hat before carrying on regardless. He was every underdog who had ever lived, and he was, in truth, a gently comic portrait of the hungry little boy Charlie himself had once been. He later described wanting every element of the costume to be a contradiction, and the genius of the final result lies precisely in those contradictions. The trousers were absurdly baggy, so the coat had to be absurdly tight. The shoes were enormous, so the hat had to be tiny. The cane suggested a gentleman of leisure, while the rest of the outfit screamed abject poverty. Every single element was quietly at war with every other element, and the total effect was pure visual comedy before the character had even taken a single step. But the true miracle happened the very moment Charlie put the costume on and began, tentatively, to walk. He later said that as soon as he was fully dressed, the character simply appeared before him, fully formed, and he knew instantly and completely exactly who this little man was. That distinctive waddling walk emerged almost on its own, feet splayed outward, cane twirling lightly, the whole figure carrying itself with an air of wounded dignity utterly at odds with its shabby, threadbare appearance. The costume wasn't merely clothing. It was a doorway, and through it stepped a complete human being with a full personality, a history, and a soul all his own. It is impossible not to see exactly where this character came from, because he came directly from Charlie's own life, distilled and quietly transfigured into pure art. The tramp was the workhouse boy who had refused to be crushed. He was the child of the slums who had somehow held onto his sense of self through poverty, abandonment, and humiliation. Every single ounce of hardship Charlie had ever endured was poured into this figure, but transformed completely, alchemized from raw misery into something tender, funny, and genuinely universal. Audiences all over the entire world understood him instantly and completely. They didn't need to know a single detail of his backstory. They simply saw the little fellow, saw his poverty and his unshakable pride, and recognized in him something profoundly, achingly familiar. The tramp did not so much arrive as detonate across the world. Audiences fell in love with the little fellow almost immediately, and Charlie, now finally writing and directing his own films, poured absolutely everything he had into refining him further. Freed at last to work entirely his own way, he slowed the comedy down deliberately, letting real emotion breathe between the laughs, mixing slapstick with genuine heartbreak in a way nobody had ever quite managed on film before him. Within a staggeringly short amount of time, the ragged boy from Walworth was becoming a genuine household name, not merely in America, but everywhere films were shown across the globe. As his fame skyrocketed to unprecedented heights, studios began waving contracts at him with figures that seemed to belong in a fairy tale. He jumped from studio to studio, each one paying him more outrageously than the last, until his annual earnings reached numbers that made him one of the very highest paid human beings on the entire planet. The boy who had once picked coins off a music hall stage floor was now negotiating genuine fortunes, and he drove those hard bargains with the shrewd, wary caution of someone who knew exactly what it meant to have absolutely nothing. It is genuinely difficult to overstate just how famous Charlie Chaplin eventually became. His little mustachioed silhouette appeared on toys, dolls, sheet music, and comic strips across the globe. People held Chaplin look-alike contests in cities everywhere. Newspapers coined an entirely new word, Chaplinitis, just to describe the sheer global mania surrounding him. In an age with no television and no internet whatsoever, he had become, quite possibly, the single most recognizable human being alive anywhere on Earth. For all his wealth and fame, Charlie remained fiercely protective of his creative independence and deeply distrustful of the studios growing rich off his genius. So in 1919, alongside three other giants of early cinema, he did something genuinely revolutionary. He helped found his own company, United Artists, so that the artists themselves, rather than the moneymen running the studios, would finally control their own work and their own profits. It was a bold, almost defiant move, a poor boy's deep-seated instinct to never again be at anyone else's mercy, translated directly into a business empire of his own. With total creative freedom finally secured, Charlie began making longer, richer, more ambitious films. The first true masterpiece to emerge from this new freedom was one that reached straight back into his own painful childhood. The Kid, released in 1921, told the story of the tramp raising an abandoned orphan boy in the slums. A tale of poverty, love, and the sheer terror of being forcibly separated from someone you cherish deeply. It was funny, yes, but it was also achingly tender, and audiences found themselves laughing and crying within the very same breath. Nobody had to explain to Charlie what a workhouse actually felt like, or what it truly meant to lose your family to forces entirely beyond your control. He had lived every single frame of that story himself. Through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, Charlie produced a string of films now regarded among the very finest ever made. In the gold rush, he turned starvation and genuine desperation into unforgettable comedy, memorably boiling and eating his own leather boot as though it were a fine gourmet meal, a joke born directly from a childhood that had known real hunger intimately. In City Lights, he blended slapstick comedy with a love story so gentle and so beautifully sad that even the toughest, most cynical critics were moved to tears. He labored over every single detail obsessively, reshooting scenes literally hundreds of times until they were absolutely flawless. Then came an earthquake that shook the entire film industry to its foundations sound. When talking pictures arrived in the late 1920s, silent film was declared dead almost overnight, and every performer in Hollywood scrambled desperately to adapt or simply vanish. Every performer, that is, except Charlie Chaplin. Stubborn, deeply principled, and utterly convinced that the tramp belonged to a wordless world, he simply refused to make his beloved character speak. He believed, with total conviction, that pantomime was a genuinely universal language, and that dialogue would only shrink the tramp's world down to a single language, shattering the very universality that was the true source of his magic. By 1936, Charlie turned his attention squarely to the anxieties of the modern world, and the result was Modern Times, a film that still feels startlingly relevant even today. In it, the tramp plays a factory worker driven to a complete breakdown by the relentless, dehumanizing pace of the assembly line, quite literally swallowed up by the gears of a monstrous machine in one of the most iconic images in all of cinema. It was the last time the beloved tramp would ever fully appear on screen in his classic form. As the world darkened steadily toward war, and a certain mustachioed tyrant rose rapidly to power in Germany, Charlie noticed something genuinely chilling. That tyrant wore a small mustache uncannily similar to the tramp's own. So Charlie made the single boldest film of his entire career. The Great Dictator, released in 1940, was his first true talking picture, and in it, he played both a humble Jewish barber and a preposterous dictator clearly modeled directly on Adolf Hitler, savagely mocking fascism at a moment when much of the world still remained nervously silent about it. The film closed not with a joke, but with the humble barber delivering a long, impassioned speech directly into the camera, pleading earnestly for peace, kindness, and tolerance among all people. For all his tenderness on screen, Charlie's personal life was a constant source of scandal and heartache. He married several times, often to women dramatically younger than himself, and these relationships frequently ended in bitter, very public divorces that the newspapers devoured with open glee. Not until his final marriage to Una, the young daughter of a celebrated playwright, did he finally find lasting stability and genuine happiness, going on to build a large and devoted family with her. In the 1940s, Charlie's fortunes began to sour dramatically. A messy and sensational paternity lawsuit dragged his private life through the courts in humiliating public detail, and even though blood tests clearly indicated he was not the father, a jury ruled against him regardless. At the same time, his outspoken political views and his open sympathy for ordinary working people drew the intense suspicion of powerful government figures who accused him of harboring dangerous left-wing sympathies. The final blow came in 1952. Charlie set sail for London to attend a film premiere, and while he was crossing the Atlantic, safely out at sea and entirely unable to argue his case, the American government quietly revoked his permit to re-enter the country, effectively exiling the most famous entertainer alive from the very nation that had made him a legend. Rather than fight it, the proud old showman chose not to return at all, settling instead with Una and their children in the quiet beauty of Switzerland. But the story wasn't quite finished. In 1972, as old bitterness gradually faded, he was invited back to America to receive an honorary Academy Award, and when he stepped onto that stage, the entire room rose to give him the longest-standing ovation in the history of the ceremony. A few years later, he was knighted by the Queen of England. He died peacefully in his sleep at his Swiss home on Christmas Day, 1977, surrounded by the large family he loved. Even death, it turned out, could not write him an entirely ordinary ending. A few months after his burial, grave robbers dug up his coffin and stole his body, attempting to extort a ransom from his grieving family. The plot eventually failed, the culprits were caught, and Charlie's remains were recovered and reburied, this time encased in protective concrete. So there it is, the entire improbable arc of a single human life, traced from a cold, damp room in a South London slum, all the way to a knighthood and a standing ovation that simply would not end. Beneath the bowler hat and the twirling cane, beneath all the fortune and the adoration and the honors, there was always that frightened, hopeful little boy, forever tipping his hat to a world that kept knocking him down. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your own warm bed, in a home with heating and running water and a locked door of your very own, perhaps spare a quiet thought for the little boy from Walworth, the one who queued for bread and dreaded the workhouse gates, who somehow held onto his dignity through all of it, and who used that hard-won dignity to make the whole aching world feel just a little bit lighter. Sleep well.